Hi everyone, my name is Sheldon. I'm a contemporary science curator at the Science Museum. So I mostly produce temporary exhibitions centered around contemporary science. We recently did a bit of an experiment surrounding a temporary exhibition. We kind of went one step way beyond this idea of having digital collections and archiving. We made an exhibition that had almost no objects, and then the objects that we did have were data sets. So we kind of had this really weird kind of experience, and we learned a lot from it. So I'll be talking through a little bit about the lessons learned that we had and what we've taken away from it. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, the important thing to note about the Science Museum is that a lot of objects just do not belong on display. This is just a standard problem of museums. These are objects that were never intended, especially in a science museum context, they were never intended to be seen by people, to be on permanently, to be looked at for theoretically centuries. These were things that were thrown together for immediate dissemination and destruction soon afterwards, or simply for the sake of engineering. So we're already working with a broken product when we're looking at museum objects. Another big problem that we have with physical objects is that they have a hard time telling their own stories. So this is one of the objects in our collection that we have that everyone, including myself, loves so very much. It's just a beautiful machine. This is the Apollo 10 command module. So here you can see this is a machine where you have seats in it for the 3 astronauts. The back of it is covered in heat damage from its re-entry into the atmosphere. As a standalone object, this object tells a very visceral, animated, exciting story, but it doesn't always capture the attention of our visitors. So objects do have a hard time telling stories on their own. So this is another big problem that we have just working specifically with objects. So as a response to this, we created an exhibition called Our Lives in Data. It was up just last year, and this was very much an experiment into how we dealt with digital objects for display. When I say digital objects, again, I'm referring to things like data sets and data visualizations as objects. We had loan agreements for our data sets that we had, which is really weird, I think. And it really allowed us to evolve beyond the limitations of traditional museum objects. So out of the, we had about 50-50 digital, as in data sets, versus physical objects within the space. So this is a very big proportion of objects being entirely digital. So in order to put this together, this exhibition, by the way, it was up for a little over a year, and it got about 1.4 million visitors, and it was very well received. Yay. Moving on. I'm not patting my own back, not at all. So in order to put this together, we had to ask the question to a series of focus groups to understand how people would actually take to this. So if we're looking at this whole wine versus glass versus drinking mentality, how do we get people that hate wine and not really enjoy drinking and not care about glasses to drink wine out of a glass? So out of these focus groups, our main responses to data were these. So this is where we're starting from. Not terribly favorable, and it's also quite understandable running to conferences and whatnot to do all the research for the exhibition. This is an honest-to-God slide that I was looking at. A lot of people were taking pictures of it, and I felt silly not to take a picture myself. But if you have a look, the one on the left is, oh yeah, the one on the left, that's the algorithm for Snapchat face swap, obviously. And the one on the right is, that's tracking the flu through the United States. It's obvious now that you look at it again, I know, but this is just the kind of material that we're working with originally, and I think it really shows just how dense and completely incomprehensible this stuff was. So the way that we dealt with looking at this completely incomprehensible content was we changed how people would see it. So firstly, it might be a little bit cheating, but we used artwork in order to portray data. So this, for example, is a visualization of one person's week of laughter. So each color and direction of each vector indicates what made them laugh, whether they laughed out loud or quietly to themselves. And then this was compared with their partner, one person based in London and another in New York. So they compared 52 different things over the course of a year into a single giant artwork. And in partway through the exhibition being open, this artwork was commissioned by the MoMA in New York. So we actually had to switch over from these postcards to using facsimiles, but we found that people still really identified it and loved it by this expression of art, even though it wasn't the authentic and original that people were seeing. The second big thing that we did was we turned visitors into data. So on the left, we have our digital mirror. So this is the introduction to the exhibition is we logged people in data. So we kept track of a facial recognition system that was open source. We guessed people's ages, their genders, and their emotional states, and contrasted that with other visitors and showed it back to them. So they were able to see where they fit into that, and they could also see how their own data was being transformed. We also have the data debater on the right. So this is like a polling station. Where we ask people questions like, should schools have access to students' social media pages in order to warn about suicide risks? Or should all of us have our DNA registered at birth so that police can track crime scenes later in life? These kinds of things. And once we collected this data, we then compared amongst visitors and showed them how liberal they were with their data. And so people could very easily connect themselves to where they sat in a whole. Also, we showed people themselves in data in other ways in a much broader scale. So on the left, we developed a digital interactive experience with a nameless analytics Facebook company in Cambridge that connected how closely people associated brands with personality traits. So we made like a personality test in order to show on a giant scale of the 1.6 billion Facebook profiles as to where they fit in terms of personality traits. And we also visualized a lot of data out of TfL. And this was a part of the data set group that was on loan. I'm going to give another example of what it is to show someone data themselves in data just by going through one of these entire journeys. 1 minute, okay, here we go. So here we've got a data visualization of a single person's week a month in data. So these are all Oyster taps. So this is one person where it's red is where you spend the most amount of time, which is usually home. Where it's green is where you spend the second most amount of time, which is usually work. So you can see this person typically taps in 9 to 5. They get home or just a little bit after 4 o'clock. They usually get into work just a little bit before 8. There's a Monday where they left a little bit early, and that Friday they left a little bit late. They don't travel at all on the weekends. So we're able to tell a story with this data specifically. So we're able to reach out and use way more interpretation here because the visitor is able to develop their own story attached to this person, and then we could just egg it on by mentioning things like they don't travel on the weekends or in evenings, so we actually know that this person very likely owned a car. And here we have 30,000 people in that same data set. Now what's really important is that we didn't know who these 30,000 people were. We suggested that people walking through the door, they could very well be looking at their own data and we would have no idea, and they wouldn't either, and it was just quite exciting. Now, by contrast, we also have this person's data. So here they took a week off, but it coincided with school holidays, so this person was very likely connected to a school. It turns out that they were a parent. You can tell they're a parent because they go to a third location after most days after work. So they leave work at about 4 o'clock. They go to a third location before they head back home. That third location, they're picking up their kid from school. So we're able to learn a lot from someone's data, and it's really quite exciting. And then, again, we can see 30,000 of these people all connected to schools. These are teachers, cleaners, students, you name it. And this is just a really big part of that story. And so based on all of this way to portray data, we got a lot of really positive feedback. from our evaluations. The thing about data-based exhibitions is that they're very easy to customize and update, they're very easy to clone, and they're also very easy to move, which were all things that we weren't particularly setting out to do, but it means that all of these things really play well into our touring program. So now I'm going to invite up my colleague Rachel, who works in the touring department. She's going to talk about how she incorporated this data exhibition into our international touring program.
Hi, I'm Rachel Bateson, as Sheldon said, from the Science Museum Group's Touring Exhibitions team. And I'm going to talk just briefly this afternoon about how we're using exhibition blueprint packs as an innovative way of touring exhibitions from the group. So blueprint packs are an alternative to traditional touring models, and they combine elements of digital and physical exhibitions. As far as we're aware, we're the only museum that's taking exactly this approach, but I would be interested to hear from anyone later who's got similar types of experience. Their use is not without challenges, and I'll come back to those later. But first, I'd like to just talk about what exactly I'm talking about when I say blueprint pack and how we're using them. So, a blueprint pack, each one starts life as a temporary exhibition in one of our museums within the Science Museum Group, and we collate information on all aspects of the exhibition. So details of where we sourced all of the objects, we collate all the graphics together, the design scheme, the press and marketing campaign, the events we ran, and we create a series of booklets for each exhibition, and these are some examples behind me. And underpinning those booklets is a suite of digital files, which also contain things like all of the AV we used, software, interactive programming, and also the digital objects of the type that Sheldon was talking about earlier. And the intellectual capital that's in that pack gives the host venue who's bought the pack what they need to create their own version of the exhibition. So we're not expecting them to copy precisely what we did. In fact, that would completely be against the point. We want them to create their own version. So this style of exhibition lends itself really well to smaller scale hot topic exhibitions. And we give our blueprint packs a 5-year lifespan from when they are first go on display in one of our museums, and that reflects their contemporary nature. And the digital format allows very easy updating for current developments, and that might be just tweaking the detail of an individual story, or in some cases it can be quite large scale, changing in and exchanging new content. We've got 4 packs in our portfolio at the moment. You've seen one of them, which is Our Lives in Data that Sheldon talked about. This is another one, 3D Printing the Future, and you can see it here in 2 of its iterations in the Science Museum and our sister museum in Manchester. So blueprint packs, it's still pretty new for us, and this is the only one that's actually been out there on display beyond our group so far. It's been around the world in some quite exotic locations, starting in Cumbria. We've been to 2 locations in Romania, and then we had simultaneous displays in Philadelphia and Rio, where it's actually just come off display. And in fact, it was very popular in Rio, and they extended the run for 6 months as a result. So I mentioned the 5-year life, but we do still have demand coming in for 3D printing. So we're at a stage now where we're considering what does that shelf life really mean. We're thinking about the permissions that we got, whether the content would need a refresh. Is it appropriate to extend the shelf life or not? And that's a conversation we're having at the moment. One of the best things about blueprint packs, I think, is illustrated really nicely in these lovely photographs of 3D printing, which is their versatility and openness to customization. So it can be scaled up or down, designed to suit the space that the venue's got. You can see there the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. They actually created a full-sized, what I call full-sized exhibition out of 3D printing. But most importantly, the exhibition can be tailored entirely as the host venue wants, so that it suits their audiences and their local needs. So in Manchester, for example, they drew on 3D textile printing, which was related very closely to local manufacturing history. And because all of the content is digital, it's very easy to do that in the way that it wouldn't be with a physical exhibition. Feedback from the host venues also told us that the versatility of this type of exhibition has also helped them with their strategic partnerships and developments. And to give you just a couple of examples, in Romania, they used this as part of their educational scientific outreach program, which was a governmental initiative. And quite differently in Rio, they focus 3D printing on how it's used in research, which helped them establish new partnerships with researchers from all sorts of fields like archaeology. Superbug's currently on in the Science Museum. Please go and see it if you haven't already, one of Sheldon's masterpieces. It's all about antibiotic resistance, and that's going to go on display in China, India, and we hope South America too. So that gives you some indication that the messages that are in these exhibitions do have global application, but then the way in which you tell the story, you can tailor so that it's accessible to audiences with very local issues going on. And one example from the Superbugs exhibition is that it contains a section that's called Humans, and that uses very individual stories to try and bring this very big concept down to the individual level. One's about a local GP, who you can see here at the end of the slide, and that's exactly the kind of story that we would encourage host venues to change. They'd switch it in for something that's immediately relevant to their own local audiences. They may well not have a GP system in their country. And that brings me very neatly on to the challenges that I mentioned at the start. One of the challenges of these packs is making sure that the original exhibition is sufficiently focused on our own audiences and what they need, but also is broad enough in scope that other venues can see the potential for their own museums. And one facet of that is making sure it's not too British. And these are some of the British stories that we've had in our exhibitions, naturally, because we are all based in England in the Science Museum Group. Another challenge that we've got with Blueprint packs is a conceptual challenge, partly because it's quite a new way of touring. It's making sure that host purchasing venues really understand what they're buying, more importantly, what they're not buying. So they're not going to get a box and they open it up and there's an exhibition. They still have to actually produce the exhibition. They have to contact the contacts that we've given them to source the objects. They have to print all the graphics. So they've got to factor in the time and resources to do that. And finally, providing resource to actually convert the original exhibition, internal-facing content, into an externally facing commercial product. That's not something that you can do simply by dropping all of the files into a central location, sadly for me, because that's something that I get to do. So those are just a few of the challenges we have. But then on the other side of that, you have this enormous benefit that you've got this package that can be sent globally without any of the costs that you have with transferring a physical exhibition from site to site. You don't have to worry about logistics, about insurance, about the environmental conditions in the host venue, because they can design it to suit themselves. So what's next for us? The latest addition to the stable is fake news, which I'm particularly excited about. It's the first one from my own museum, the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford. Again, it's a very current topic, but this time focusing on media technology. This one could be staged entirely without museum objects, which is, I think, again, quite exciting because it opens it up to a wider range of venues because so much of the content is digital or facsimiles. So Sheldon and I have talked about some of the ways that we're approaching digital media in the Science Museum Group. We'd be very happy to take any questions or speak to you later. Thank you.